Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's AustCham event. Hi, Kane. This is a special program produced in collaboration with the AustCham People Forum, and I'd like to welcome and acknowledge Hong Tran and Sandra Lung, co-chairs of the AustCham People Forum on the line today, as well as members. My name's Stefanie Evennett. I'm the Chief Executive here at AustCham. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today. We have a very special speaker today. I'm going to jump straight to it because we only have an hour with her, and I know you will all have a lot of questions. It's my pleasure to introduce Karen Loon, former Senior Executive turned author, as our guest speaker today. Karen is a non-executive director with more than 30 years of international cross-cultural experience, working with organisations across the Asia Pacific. She is a former financial services assurance partner at PwC Singapore, where she was the banking and capital markets leader. In addition to that role, Karen was also PwC Singapore and Asia Pacific diversity leader and a member of the PwC Global Diversity Leadership Team and Global Financial Services Diversity Steering Committee. She's the author of a recently released book, which I highly encourage you to seek out, and we'll share the links of where you can find the book after this session. It's called Fostering Culturally Diverse Leadership in Organisations, Lessons from Those Who Smash the Bamboo Ceiling. In today's session, Karen will share her insights and perspectives from her experience, as well as research and findings from her book. We're going to be in a fireside chat format, which seems a little odd for us heading into summer in Australia there, Karen, but I'm really pleased to have you here today, and thanks so much to the People's Forum for joining. Let's get into it, Karen. It's a big topic. We've got a lot to cover. I know that your book led you to interview many leaders across organisations in Singapore, the Asia Pacific, Australia, and many of them had really fascinating stories to tell about either their own personal journey or what they saw play out in their organisation. And I'm curious, as the person who's closest to this and our resident expert here today, whose story struck you the most, and why is that?
Okay, firstly, thank you for the chance to speak. Really honoured to have this opportunity. So maybe just I can set a little bit of context because people may wonder what the research is about and my background. So I am Australian, currently sitting in Sydney at the moment. You know, I have had a real fascination about the reason why there is this concept of a bamboo ceiling in some organisations in Australia. In that often people with Asian backgrounds don't hit the ceilings. They hit ceilings in their organisations. So I actually interviewed, you know, a number, over 30 current and former, largely Big Four partners, as well as others in leadership roles, just really to understand their stories about what helped them make it into leadership rather than what were the barriers. And so what I found really interesting, because I didn't take the very typical story of, you know, okay, where did you start work and what did you do? I actually interviewed people and asked them about their own family life that may have shaped them, and what were some of the barriers. And so what I thought was really interesting was, you know, people do make it into leadership roles in Australia, not as many of them. But obviously the stories are very, very different about how they adapted. And so in chapter 1 of my book, I relayed a couple of stories. One of the gentlemen was called Ben. I called him Ben in this for the purpose of this. And one was called Michael. And so they both basically had the similar background. They were partners in Big Four firms. They were very, very successful in technical fields. And yet, you know, one of them described situations where he was actually picked on. This was a guy called Ben. And he was picked on at school, and that whole experience seemed to have shaped how he dealt with things. So he became a bit of a fighter. He always felt he was a bit of a loner, and he always felt he needed to be very, very resilient, because that was sort of something he learned at school, in the playground, or as he grew up. Then I had another guy called Michael, and Michael was actually, he got picked on in the playground as well, but he actually learned that and thought, well, hang on, I'm not going to fight. I'm going to try and understand these people. And that really shaped how he deals with things. And he's actually a lot more empathetic and tries to get to know people. And even though he was different, he didn't let it affect him as much. And so those two different stories I thought were really interesting, because we often hear a lot of stereotypical views about people with different backgrounds and their stories, but actually everyone's story is quite different. And whilst there are stereotypes, we do need to dig down further and help people because we are different. So that was the story. They were the stories that really I found were interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating how much that personal experience at a young age can shape people's response to issues that they can face in the workplace. I guess is part of what you're sharing there. And in this context, it's about race, it's about ethnicity, it's about, you know, their access to opportunities and how they approach that. I want to talk a little about the company response now, I guess, in terms of how companies have approached this and what you found, and not just through the book, but also through your experience with PwC. What would you say is the most difficult aspects of implementing a diversity and inclusion program or initiative from the company perspective?
So I think, I mean, it's, you know, most companies have focused a lot on gender, I think in Hong Kong and Singapore, everywhere, but it's become a lot more mainstream now. And so I think my main, I guess, experience from, you know, rolling out programs at PwC and talking to others is, I guess, if you think, put yourselves in the shoes of business leaders, because usually the business leaders are the ones who have to look at these decisions. They just have so many challenges they need to deal with. You know, we've got to make money. We've got all those different stakeholders to manage. We have to make money. We have to do a whole lot of things. And so therefore, I think it's really challenging. The initial step I would say is how to get the leaders across the line that this is the right thing to do. And it's not just sort of a tick the box thing. And the next thing I would say is it's not just a tick the box thing, is that people actually realize that the culture actually is the thing that needs to be in place and work well for things to thrive. And so I actually found my own experience was trying to get the leaders across the line initially, so the most senior leaders, to say, oh, look, this is something that's important. There's a business reason why we do it. There's also, you know, social reasons why we do it. And therefore, what do we do to drive the change and beyond KPIs? So I can chat a little bit more about that if it's of interest, but it's not easy, because we've got as leaders, got so many things that we need to prioritize.
I think, yeah, let's unpack that a bit further, I guess. You know, how, like at a really practical level, is in your experience, how do you get that organization, the leadership team on board with these initiatives, no matter what they are, but specifically those that are related to, you know, ethnic diversity and leadership?
Yeah. So I think a lot of it, I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's trying to help identify for various individuals what are the motivations behind, you know, what they do at work, and how can you try best to link up diversity to something that means something to them very personally. And for some leaders, you know, you can do the rational side of things and talk a bit about the profits and the fact that business might not necessarily come if you don't necessarily focus on diversity and inclusion because you don't have the clients or you don't have the talent. But for others, I think, you know, you do have to try and get it down to something quite personal, you know, whether it's their personal story or whether it's something that actually affects them as well, because often, and I talk a lot about this in the book, it's really those emotional experiences that inhibit change. And I think also for a lot of individuals, when they hear the words diversity or they think KPIs, it creates actually additional stresses that may or may not be related to what we're talking about. And so how do you try to find those ways that could be the barriers to change and try and help bring those down? And usually it's because of, you know, I think for business leaders, they have a lot of pressure. Not easy, it takes time. But I think you need to recognize as both the individuals, but as well as the company culture that sometimes is, and actually sometimes more so the company culture is something that can inhibit the change. The norms of all the ideas that there are things that we can't do in our company, then people feel that, oh, they might go, this is a great idea, but I can't do it in my company, or I don't think it's right to do it in my company, or I can't say anything. And so it's not easy. I would say it requires to dig in to try and understand what's really, holding people back, particularly when it comes to ethnicity, because some of these situations are very, very entrenched because of the way people are brought up.
Yeah. I do want to invite everyone on the line here to participate in this discussion, and we don't have to do that in the traditional way of waiting to the end for questions. If you would like to jump in, share an experience, or ask a question of Karen, just raise your virtual hand or put something in the chat, and we can bring it up so that we've got it on the table. I thought that was really interesting how you talked about people who want to be advocates for change, and that could be for, I guess, a number of reasons. Like you said, it could be a company imperative. They could be motivated by a personal experience. I guess, what advice would you give to those people who are advocates for diversity and inclusion within their company, where they are facing some, maybe it could be resistance, but it could also be potentially apathy, right?
Yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, when I actually think about it, you say apathy, sometimes I think the challenge is that it's because people don't know what to do. I think, it usually means that they may be torn between this idea that I agree with the situation, but in practice, I can't feel I can do it in the company, or I've got too many other things I need to deal with, and so I feel I can't do something. And so I actually, my personal view is, advocacy is great, but I think we have to put ourselves in the shoes of the other people, because what you're trying to do is to create an environment which is working well, the dynamics are positive. And so I would say, one of the things is to try to really understand how others in the majority feel, and try to get the sense of, well, what's holding them back as well. And I know that's not easy, it takes time, but usually it's not necessarily what people say, it's often their behaviors, which are the things that lead to people feeling they don't belong. And so I would say, try and talk to others, try to, get the views of others, speak to people at different parts of the organization, not just people at your level, because I think this is something that's important, but particularly the leaders as the middle managers. So really trying to unpack some of that, rather than, I think there's a challenge if advocates try and push too much of the advocacy view, and they don't necessarily think of the views of the majority or the others who may be in the situations of power and control.
I mean, there's a pretty complex approach there, and I'm sure people would have some views on sort of doing the work for the majority, as you call them. I mean, I'd be interested to hear, I guess, what you felt worked in your experience with PwC. Were there some specific activities or strategies that moved the needle?
Yeah. So I'd say the biggest thing really is, it's really trying to make sure that diversity inclusion is built into the whole organization, but particularly having a C-suite leader who really, was an advocate himself, and actually walked the talk. So, I mean, I've left PwC 4 or 5 years ago, but one of the leaders that is actually pretty well known for what he's done in the US is Tim Ryan, who's the US firm leader. And I think, he was always a real advocate for change, but even more so after he went into the CEO role. And, so I think he, would correspond on views he felt was uncomfortable, particularly around race in the US. He also worked with other companies in the US. And I think he's also really tried to make sure that the people they put into various roles were actually, also diverse. So I actually think the tone from the top is really important. Obviously, you need to have everyone in the organization doing it, but I personally don't think some of these things are things that can be delegated to like a D&I leader, an HR leader, and then the C-suite leaders think, look, that's my job done. It actually needs the whole organization. And it actually needs the, the purpose, the values, and then the behaviors and how the lived behaviors to be aligned. And so that requires, consideration of how you assess people, how you look at what's an appropriate behavior or not. So really thinking about these things quite holistically. So rather than just an HR initiative. Yeah.
And I guess there's some of those things that you mentioned are, I guess, applicable across lots of different types of diversity and inclusion initiatives. Are there specific, actions that you've seen companies take, perhaps that you learnt about through your book or the research that has specifically addressed, let's say in Australia, better representation of Asian Australians in a big group? I'm going to use that term if I can, to better represent, I guess, Australia's demographics and the representation within community. Something really curious if you've seen something really specific that addressed this issue.
Yeah. So, I mean, it is true. I think if you look specifically at Australia and what's actually happened, I think like in the US, there's been quite a lot of increased anxiety and stress amongst people with Asian Australian backgrounds because of the racism and that sort of thing that's happened. And I think, sometimes these things have led to incidents in organizations that, have got people very uncomfortable as well. And so I have seen a couple of organizations or have heard of a couple of organizations more recently really trying to help to be a lot more empathetic and recognizing that particularly the Asian Australian staff members at work are quite stressed. And so by empathy, I'm, I guess, talking about really situations where senior leaders are trying to understand how people with Asian Australian backgrounds are feeling, really hearing their views, pairing, people up with leaders so that they can share their experiences, and really putting each other in each other's shoes. And I think, some of those situations, from what I understand, have actually led to people being a lot more appreciative that, some people with different backgrounds actually are, feeling a lot of stress at work and how to deal with it. So to me, it really comes down to a lot more humility. Really not just sort of talking to groups and having like, multicultural celebrations, but really getting down to individual activities that get people to bond, get to know each other and understand each other. So goes back to that original story, I think, is that when we're talking about different groups of different backgrounds, you might think people are all similar because of the stereotypes we've heard, but actually we're all individuals as well. And how do we try to create experiences that recognize the demographics of those groups, but also individualize things as well?
I'd love to hear from some of our D&I practitioners in the group. I know, Sandra, this is part of your role, and I think we have Gabriella on the line as well. Is what Karen is sharing resonating with your experience? I know you're working across Asia as well, not specifically Australia alone. Maybe Sandra, some reflections, if I can ask.
Oh, thanks, Steph, and thanks, Karen. I'm not taking copious amounts of notes, but really just absorbing a lot of the information that you're sharing, and it's really hitting home, I think, the point about being in other people's shoes and recognizing that as a firm, there's no one size fits all and there's no silver bullet. And the way that we've tackled, and I work for JP Morgan, which during COVID has had their own, I guess, areas of focus, I would say, with the Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, Asian Lives Matter, or American Asian Lives Matter. But I think the question that I wanted to ask you, because I haven't found a solution for it, is how do you get those that are really sitting on the sidelines, or the leaders, if that's was particular area of interest or focus for your book, which we'll get the link to after this. How did you get them to come to the table and have those conversations? Because where I'm finding it easy is I've got those leaders that already know exactly how they're role modeling cultural inclusion, all that kind of great stuff there. And we see the results when we put metrics and we put quotas to things, and they're kicking goals. But it's the ones that are, supposed allies, or they're not true allies, or they just flat out don't get the story, and that breeds toxicity down the line. Any case examples that you've gone through or experienced, or you can, you're trialing, that you can kind of share with us? That would be really helpful.
I think thanks for the question. I think I didn't necessarily cover that as much in my book. So my experience was more to interview people who've actually made it. But I guess, not easy. I mean, I was leading D&I at PwC in Singapore, and we were trying to do things in the region. I think it takes time, obviously, and I agree that the biggest challenge is, neutralizing the people who are negative and then trying to, make the others positive. I guess, I think it's a balance, because, I mean, it's interesting. People sort of think because I'm the accountant, we should be pushing numbers, and I think data is really important and KPIs are really important. But we obviously need to make sure that people don't feel resentful. They don't actually, behave in ways that are not inclusive as well. So I just think I guess part of it, I think, is trying to see if there are ways to link up, the way that we assess people, the behaviors. And if there are those gaps, is to try and, change it through that process. It's not necessarily KPIs, but at PwC, we did actually quite early on, when we changed our competencies and our behavior or patterns, we actually tried to make sure that it was all very clear, the alignment between purpose, values, and the behaviors that we expected of our people. So that, hopefully over time, people actually, recognize this is the way we do things, and then they actually live those behaviors. But I agree, it's not easy, particularly for more senior people who may be motivated by different things.
Thanks, Karen.
I guess building on that, Karen, you talked about having the right framework. I mean, what, and perhaps this is a question for the HR professionals on the line as well, what are the, when things are going well, what's the outcome? What do you think should be, the end result? And I know it's going to be different in every organization, but from your perspective, and I guess from the people that you interviewed, what were they looking for? What did smashing the bamboo ceiling mean to them?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it is really around, for a lot of those leaders, was around a place where they felt that they belonged and they could do the things that they really wanted to do. And I think that's very hard to then, how do you then, link that up with what does that mean for the organization? But it's really around, positive leaders who feel that they can contribute in the ways that they want to personally, because, people go to work for many reasons, not just to make money. But, but yeah, they could do it personally, as well as contribute through their work. And so I think it's just really an environment where people are positive, rather than, I guess, environments where people are more negative, and the toxicity we talked about, or the politics start coming into place where people feel very stressed. Look at stress levels, how people feel. A lot of that really comes down to how stress is playing out, how everyone's very stressed. When we're stressed, we actually don't necessarily behave the right way, both individually and in groups. So how do we try and balance things up so that people can do the things they want to do?
I guess further to that question, are there ways that you've seen, or the experiences from the people you interviewed, where a company was able to involve and promote underrepresented populations without making them feel tokenized?
Yeah. I mean, to me, a lot of it is more, and I'm sure a lot of the people in this discussion do this as well, it's really trying to make sure that, on the other hand, that the people, these people of these groups actually get the opportunities that everyone should be getting, So I know a lot of companies are doing that for gender, whether it's making sure they get the right stretch opportunities or equal representation for secondments, or that they get mentors, or that they have sponsorship. I actually think that, sometimes, what happens, and people don't necessarily have a culture lens on, is that these people, because they're maybe don't get on with the leaders as well, or they're different, don't get those opportunities as much. But actually, I think more focus should be on making sure that there's appropriate representation of these arrangements, whether it's leadership programs and others. And that's really where people will shine and thrive. But yeah, there are some, I think when I was thinking about where I've seen good examples of initiatives where companies are really trying to do things, I think actually the UK is doing a lot. Because I think they've been focusing a lot more on social mobility probably for the last 10 plus years than what we would see in maybe Asia or even Australia. So really recognizing, how do we change also, how do we recruit, the types of people we recruit, even the qualifications that we recruit from, how do we try to support some of these communities as well. So I think there are some examples, particularly in the UK, where companies are actually going further, recognizing that maybe the professions that they join or the the industries they're in are actually perhaps making certain situations worse just because of the types of people they're looking for.
Any comments on this concept of, I guess, picking up what we've seen work in other areas like gender diversity, and moving them over to address cultural or ethnic representation? Do you think that that's a strategy that companies can use and it will be successful?
I actually think companies can think about what they do with gender, but I don't necessarily think it's always the right answer. So I think, just back down here in Australia, I was chatting to some people, and it's true, they do a lot of things for gender. But then they're saying, oh, look, we don't have situations where we have, good representation of people, different backgrounds. I said, have you actually thought about what you do for gender and perhaps applying that lens to what you do for other areas of diversity? So I think there are good ideas. But I think that the challenge is that, history and society does shape how people think about race and ethnicity. And so it does, I think, need a certain level of sensitivity, different level of sensitivity, because if you think about gender, everyone has a mother and everyone often has sisters, brothers, aunties. So, but not everyone will have a friend or know of people from a different background. And they may actually have, stereotypes or views or other things that actually shape how they behave. So, it does need, situations where, I've had some situations where we call them safe spaces where we can actually share about these things. We can actually be comfortable and create that psychological safety, that it's okay to talk about these things. And rather than having that political sort of sensitivity or the fact that we feel very uncomfortable raising questions. And I actually feel that psychological safety is one of those things that's really, really important, where people feel safe to talk about some of these areas, particularly when it comes to race and ethnicity.
Fantastic. I mean, what role do you see some of the broader context having on the way in which companies respond to this? Sandra mentioned the company that she worked for and the social movements and how they how the company was needed to respond to those. Do you see some of the same engagement from companies with these bigger social movements in, say, Singapore or in Sydney, where you are now?
Yeah, I think things are changing. So I think, I do think there's going to be more social movements. These things are not going to go away because I think there's going to be huge challenges in many countries. I think there's still the debate is out there what companies do. So, in Asia, for example, I think, many companies would say that, I don't think that's my responsibility to actually have a point of view and act on some of these things. On the other hand, I think with this whole push around ESG and the fact that investors are expecting more, I know in Hong Kong you've got, various rules currently focused on gender diversity on boards, but, companies will be starting to disclose more about their diversity. and investors will start to push a little bit more. I actually don't think this is going to go away. And I think that ESG push will be something that means that companies do need to act. I think the question is, how do they do it in a way that actually is meaningful rather than, I guess some people have been saying diversity washing, which I think is a bit of a risk, that companies do put a lot of things on their websites and that sort of thing, but they really need to make sure that they live those behaviors, because, the bar is being raised, and the last thing that people want are situations that, show that actually what they're saying to the public is not necessarily the way that behaviors are lived by their people.
Fantastic. I can see a lot of nodding from those on line that I can see, and I know some of us haven't got our cameras on, but do we have any questions from those on the line for Karen, or points of view that you'd like to share around this?
I got a quick question for you, Karen.
Yep.
Have you seen any organization that has done cultural diversity well?
Yeah, this has been a question a few people have asked me. I actually, and I know this organization pretty well, I've actually been using this as the example. DBS Bank in Singapore. So maybe because, in Singapore, we have a lot of diversity, but, there is a Chinese majority as well. I actually feel that, and it's not just cultural diversity, I'm just saying it's general diversity as well. I think they've always had, good gender diversity without a lot of programs in place. And I think they also recognize that, they need certain amount of cultural diversity because of the clients they deal with, and the fact that they also they're operating in, 5 or 6 different countries around the region. And they also try to, use their mobility programs to move their Singapore talent to those countries, and also vice versa. So, Singaporeans or China nationals or Hong Kong, people from Hong Kong will go to head office as well. And so I actually feel that they've actually been pretty good at these programs, but not necessarily by design. It's just really that the culture is something that, really encourages them to work well. So that would be the example I share.
Thank you.
John, I think you had a question.
Yeah, g'day. Yeah, I was just I had a question. I know you. Hi, Karen. I'm John.
Hi, John.
I'm Australian as well. I'm currently working in Hong Kong. And I hear a lot of friends and associates. They talk about sort of conflicting, Western values and Eastern values, because as you said, I think your interviews with people, how they had to adapt. Obviously, growing up in an Asian family and so forth, it is different, right? The values are potentially different. And an example would be self-promotion.
Yep.
Obviously, if you don't live in that environment of self-promotion, then when you obviously go to work, then that is a bit strange for them, right? And they have to change. If they don't adapt, then obviously they will reach that bamboo ceiling.
Yep.
So yeah, just want to get your views and comments on that, and how they from your interviews, how they adapted, and what was the learnings.
Yeah. So thanks for the question. And so that's really what I wanted to understand, is really how people made it, because there was so much literature out there saying people just hit a bamboo ceiling. And I thought, look, if my idea was, if I am the things that we can learn from those lessons that would help us to be better at managing this for companies. And when I talk about companies, it could be situations in Australia or the UK, but even I think that some of the findings are useful even for example, companies in Asia where they're multinationals, because from speaking to some people, they'll say, look, our Asian populations actually still also in Asia want to thrive in our multinationals, but sometimes they're challenged because it is actually a Western culture as well. And so I found that those people who actually survived were really, they recognized that they needed to flex themselves and learn how to adapt. So I talk about the fact that they were open to trying new things, but not just the technical things, but it was also a lot around the networking, the social skills, and experiment, but they also knew how to manage their stress and their tensions. Because I think sometimes, you know, when we're under stress, we actually tend to behave in a way that's very comfortable to us and our preferred way, which is often actually the ways that we've learned in our families. So in our families, we may, you know, under stress, not necessarily try and, I guess I would say the word, project ourselves. You know, in a Western environment, you do need to self-promote yourself, but your natural behavior at home, if you're Asian, maybe that I don't do that. And so people who actually made it in these environments actually knew how to, you know, pivot themselves, adjust. Yes, it was very, very uncomfortable, but they learned how to manage that, and then they continue to progress on. And so I think a lot of it is really about trying to help for the people with Asian backgrounds. It was more around trying to help them to learn to adapt to the environments and to be open and to have, I guess I called them secure bases of people they could get help from, you know, because you're dealing with a lot of stress when you become a leader. And, you know, you need your family, you need your mentors, you need your sponsors, you know, you need to have leadership programs and those things, because they help you manage those tensions and the stresses that you're going through. And then I think for the culture, the organizations was really all around the psychological safety, but particularly around sponsorship. I found sponsorship programs for people who were different were actually really, really critical in helping to get those people to understand and have people to help advocate and support them. So I hope I've answered your question. I've covered it very briefly, but you know, I think it's I guess what I'm saying here is it needs the individuals to recognize that they need to try and survive and learn how to adapt. It also needs the right corporate culture, which actually tries to help these people to thrive as well.
Thanks, Karen. I think, yeah, there's definitely insights there, especially around the securing a base to lean on. I think that's what sometimes the challenge is as well, because they... Thank you.
Thanks.
We have a question that leans into the company culture, and I guess some of the informal get-togethers and the way in which different groups interact. You know, when I think about the analogy with gender, some of the early conversations would be, oh, the men have the golf clubs, or the golf group, for example, was something that years ago used to be talked about. And we have a question here about, you know, how can companies, you know, build a culture for these kinds of incidental activities that can be more inclusive, not, you know, not sort of the what in Australia is very common, the kind of after work drinks or things that, you know, maybe don't work for different groups of people. Do you have any observations on, you know, practices that can create that accidental opportunities for building, you know, relationships that might not otherwise be there through work?
Yeah. No, I think I guess to me a lot of it's about leaders being conscious of that and not always trying to have the same types of activities. But I actually also think it's worth trying to find, you know, situations that mix and get people of different backgrounds to meet. And so one of the things that I know we did at PwC, which is still going, which actually went really well, was that we would try and arrange something called Lunch with a Stranger. So, you know, just something, they had a cafeteria, you know, you could nominate yourself. We tried to make sure we got people with different backgrounds and others. And it was like speed dating. So you had your lunch and then you had a chat with someone for 10 minutes and then you'd move on to the next person. And I tell you, the most amazing discussion was really when our senior partner was there. And, you know, you'd sit there and watch, and some junior person would have no idea they were talking to the senior partner until maybe they got to the end of the discussion, because, you know, you want something that's quite natural where people just talk about and get to know each other as humans and that sort of thing, not talking about their titles. And it really, I think, broke down the barriers, because I think particularly in Asia, you know, it's more challenging because, you know, I know in Singapore, my junior people would never, ever want to go and say hello to me, because it's very hierarchical, they're very respectful and that sort of thing. But actually, you know, if there are different ways to try and break down those barriers in ways that help people feel comfortable and build relationships up, I think that actually can be really helpful. So sometimes some organized ways to break down barriers can be actually good. And break down those hierarchies where people feel that they can't raise questions or they don't have a relationship with someone who's different.
Very interesting. Kane, I know you have a question. You're on mute right now, Kane. Oh, there we go.
Hi, Stefanie, it's Sabrina.
Oh, hi, Sabrina. Hi.
Karen, it's very nice to meet you as well. I don't think we have our camera on here, but everybody is busily eating and, enjoying
no problems.
what you're saying. What I find this really fascinating, and I'm agreeing with some things, disagreeing with others, and I have found, and maybe it's because I work in such an amazing organization, but I find that the more authentic as a leader you are, the easier breaking down some of these barriers can be. However, where I do find the challenge is finding that balance of managing up versus managing down, because sometimes the organization has different priorities, and I'm not speaking on behalf of mine, but what I've seen in Hong Kong is when it comes to gender and diversification, some of these initiatives are a box ticking. And whilst we as leaders might feel incredibly passionate about it, and you manage with your teammates in the right way, how do you manage upward properly to actually invoke change?
Yep, not an easy thing to deal with. I guess I agree, and I think unfortunately that's a challenge that we're always going to face. Is that there are always these tensions because of what the company wants to do versus what all the different people want to do, and managing. I mean, I guess for me, I think keep going. But for those of us who have got that position, so I'm a non-executive director and others, I actually feel we have a big role to play, because honestly, culture and organizational culture is our people is so important. And so I think we need to try and continue to say, look, this is important. We don't have businesses unless we can keep our people. I find that maybe sometimes linking the discussions back to the need for talent and the need to keep people, and that the young millennials actually want this, I think is maybe a more powerful, way to try and say, hey leaders, you just can't let us deal with it. You actually also need to try and shape the culture and do the right thing too. Otherwise, we don't have a sustainable business. But not easy, I agree, because you want to do the right thing, and yet you're being squeezed to do so many things from both sides.
That gave me an idea, and I was thinking, as we're embarking on this era of having a really hard time attracting the right type of talent, we can start to look at, when you're interviewing people, finding out really what motivates them. And if you consistently hear that this is a topic that's very motivational for new hires, which I think it will be, that will be a very strong message to very senior leadership, that this has to be at the forefront and it has to be real and authentic.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, for probably, at least the last nearly decade, that's been important for gender. And I think that, increasingly this is going to be important, because, with the social media and other things, I think this is something that people want. They want to succeed, but an organization that's a little bit more traditional is not going to cut it for them.
Thank you so much.
That's great, and it really talks about what are the things that are attracting new recruits to the company and what's going to keep them, and where we see more and more people linking their purpose or their values to their company, it could really have an impact. Yeah. We have about 10 minutes left. I know we've covered a lot of ground. Are there any, I guess, kind of long-term consequences if a company ignores this? If a company just sort of is like, look, it's not important to us, our shareholders don't care, the management team's diverse enough, like, you know, it's not going to make us extra money. What are the consequences of that, in your view, of ignoring cultural and ethnic diversity?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, it depends on what's important for the business and what it's been set up for. But I think for businesses that are more multinational, I actually think it's going to be really important, because I think this is something that, you know, the people want. And going back to this whole idea of what talent wants, is that people want to work with an organization that's aligned with what they want to do, that gives them the opportunities to do the things that they want to within their organizations, because they're not just there to go and work. They're there because there's a particular amount of things that they can do at work that satisfy them in different ways. And so I actually view it as part of long-term sustainability. Unless you get the right people and you get the diversity you need, plus create the right culture, you may not necessarily have the best business you can get. And in today's world where so much of it is led by people, you need people with different insights and different thoughts, and that includes the experiences of people who've lived in different places. And so, you know, there's one saying, they say diversity without inclusion leads to exclusion. So yes, I think the cultural diversity is important, but you also need the inclusion, which links back to the culture. So that environment where everyone can belong and they can feel that there's benefits, and all of us having different perspectives, but we can create some wonderful things. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So I'd probably say, look, it's a long-term thing, and you know, if you think about most of our careers, things have changed a lot, even say over 20 years. So I think this one is probably going to continue.
I'd like to hand to our co-chairs, Hong and Sandra. Any final comments or observations based on Karen's sharing, or your own experiences with companies, or driving these initiatives, or observations on what you've seen with clients or partners? Who's going to go first? Sandra.
I'll let Sandra go first.
Look, I think for me, I kind of just take it back to like my own personal experience, and then how we've really applied it in the workforce. I think representation is really important, especially for our young talent. And when I look back at my career journey starting out, when I looked up, I didn't see people like myself or others. And this was, and to be frank, this is when I first started out in Australia. But what I did have were definitely leaders that wanted to do better and recognize that, hey, you know, I don't look like Sandra, but I'm here and I have those years of experience that I can impart, and I can bring people along that journey. And that kind of led me into recognizing, hey, these are the types of organizations or the leaders that I wanted to follow. And I moved into organizations that were multinational. They had those, you know, international firms. Granted, it was always in banking and finance. And now as I've moved into a role that is very neatly titled diversity, equity, inclusion, I have a vested interest to get it right. And not necessarily just a role model, but put in those strategies in place to allow leaders to do that, and then look at the long-term benefits of having the right leaders in the right positions in the right levels and pipelining that through. And one of the biggest things that Karen, as you were sharing, and Stefanie asking those poignant questions as well, was what I think I need to do a little bit more in my organization is solve for that inclusion piece for those that are not necessarily minority groups because of just how it's structured. In Australia, yes, we definitely need to solve for the minority group, but identifying, even though we can't solve for who is the minority group in Asia when we make up the majority, is still putting them through those opportunities, whether it's through sponsorship programs and whether it's through just having the more frequent interactions so that people could walk in each other's shoes a little bit more to hopefully get those long-term benefits, because it's going to be a long-term game that we're playing to to get those results. I'm not going to be able to convince shareholders or our senior leaders that, hey, we're going to see this in 18 months. You're going to see an uptick in X, Y, and Z. So those were my kind of takeaways and also insights as well. So thank you, Karen. Thanks, Steph. And Hong, what about you? How are you feeling and what are you thinking?
Well, it's complicated, isn't it? And it's a constant learning. And I learn new stuff every day. I just came off a year-long investigation for a very large US-based organization with reach all around the world, and it was an investigation to racial, cultural diversity, and we were talking about sponsorship before, and actually in that investigation I found that sponsorship works against ethnic diversity or cultural diversity, because the people who went to look for sponsorship went to people who supported them in the US, where headquarters and decisions were made, and they tend to talk the same language along the lines of, I think, what Tim was saying before. They spoke the same language. They drank alcohol, and to the exclusion of the culture out, the prevalence of some cultures out this way. So we found it actually worked. The sponsorship programs worked against cultural diversity, and so. But it's a delicate balance, because you do need sponsorship to progress talent through the ranks and keep your eye. And so there they even had a dedicated program to scout the talent and have succession plans, and yet it still failed to pick up those issues. So what I got out of all of that, a year long it took, we interviewed lots and lots of people, and went through tons of paperwork, and but the bottom line was it's complicated. And so that's the first point. The second point is sometimes for me, just going back to your earlier question, Sandra, sometimes the simplest approach is the best. And to your point earlier about how do you get those who are sitting on the fence, the leaders who are sitting on the fence, who are apathetic and just swing a bit more towards taking a bit more interest and taking up the challenge. And the approach I adopted here, which I saw have some traction, was to just fake it till you make it, right? And it was very simple. It was, all I need you leaders to do is to get in the photo whenever we have an event, to go introduce an event. And we did that for a little bit, and pretty soon we found them turning around to us going, I chair the Diversity and Inclusion Committee here at this firm, turning around going, oh, when's your next event? When can I do the next? And so it was actually just the simplest. I could talk to the cows come home on the business case and the KPIs and all that, and at the end of the day it was just, we need you for this IG pick. And eventually they all started of their own volition turning up. So it's just programming them to think about it and taking some sort of action.
No,
I love it. I'm going to do that next.
Sometimes
things happen. You'll know where that came from. The bright idea on today's call.
You can hashtag me. Karen, thank you. Also, I want to say thank you very much for your time, Karen. You've been wonderful, and I've learned, again, as I said, it's a constant journey, and I keep learning new stuff every day.
No, thank you. No, fantastic. I just thank you for sharing. I just saying the idea of making people look good sometimes works. We just have to make sure that it is actually followed through in action. But yeah, I do agree that sometimes a good strategy is to make them look good. But make sure they act the same way as well.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Karen, for joining, sharing your insights. Thanks, Sandra and Hong, for hosting, and all of the committee for turning up today and your questions. I'd like to let you know that you can follow us on LinkedIn if you're not already. Karen we'll send around the link to where people can get the book and contact you if they have any further questions. Look forward to seeing you all at the next committee meeting. With that, we're closing out. Good afternoon.
Thanks, Stefanie.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen.
Thanks, everyone. Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.